Well, hello everyone. I'd like to, please feel free to find a seat. We've got plenty up here as well. I'd like to welcome you to this event at the Medieval Institute. My name is Thomas Berman. I'm the director of the Medieval Institute, and we're very fortunate today to be initiating what will be an annual lecture series in honor of the Reverend Constantine Mathews, who was a Greek Orthodox priest who did a master's degree here in theology, and whose sons, Nikephoros and Vasilios Mathews, have endowed a lecture endowment for us, so that every year we can bring in a distinguished scholar of Byzantium to lecture to us. And I'm delighted that you're all here. I'm delighted to see so many people face to face, and at this point I will welcome Father Alexis Torrance to introduce our speaker. Alexis.
I'll just go around here so I have a piece of paper and got the camera. So yes, it gives me tremendous satisfaction to welcome you to our inaugural Mathews Lecture at last in Byzantine Studies, in person and streaming. I'd also like to acknowledge the Mathews brothers, through whose generosity we're able to have this event. We're absolutely thrilled, especially given the straitened circumstances of the past 2 years, that we're able to welcome into our midst Professor Margaret Mullett, OBE. There could be no better person to launch the Mathews Lecture series than her. By the same token, there's no way for me to do her justice in this brief introduction. Her glittering career in Byzantine studies has also been a path-breaking one. Alongside her impeccable scholarly contributions on Theophylact of Ochrid, the Evergetes Monastery, the place of friendship in Byzantium, and quite frankly, the whole field of Byzantine literature. She's been a tireless foundress, builder, and promoter of Byzantine studies throughout the world. At Queen's University, Belfast, together with shepherding countless undergraduate and graduate students in Byzantine studies, she spearheaded the foundation of the Institute of Byzantine Studies there, as well as the Belfast Byzantine Texts and Translation series. Later, she was instrumental in the formation of the Center for Byzantine Cultural History in collaboration with the universities of Newcastle, Sussex, and Queen's. From 2009 until 2016, she served as Director of Byzantine Studies at Dumbarton Oaks, belonging to Harvard, but located in Washington, D.C. Atop this academic synchronon of Byzantine studies, her positively infectious love for all things Byzantine, but just as importantly, for all the people in the field, however junior or senior, shone through even more resplendently. It's no exaggeration to say that she has shaped the field, in particular in its openness to a multitude of approaches and disciplines, its openness to allied or associated fields, or the classics, late antiquity, of course medieval studies. She represents all that is best about the field. And if you don't trust my judgment, I defer to Her Majesty the Queen herself, who in 2006 honored Professor Mullett for her contributions to the field as an officer of the Order of the British Empire, hence the OBE. Her talk for us will take us through a fascinating, if sadly rather neglected text, the Christos Paschon. I won't say more, as she'll tell you everything you need to know. I just want to note that it's particularly fitting that we have this topic for our inaugural lecture, given that Father Constantine Mathews, after whom the lecture series is named, not only served as a priest in this area, in fact in the parish where I also help out, he in the 1970s, but he did his master's degree not only in theology but in liturgical studies here at Notre Dame. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mullett.
Well, can you hear me at the back okay? That's one of the kind of introductions expectations it's impossible to live up to. Thank you, Alexis. I'm really thrilled to be back here, and not just because it's the first chance in 2 years to see people and meet students and take a book off the shelf. It's just such a wonderful experience in general, but it's just great to be back in Medday. So, the Christos Paschon, attributed in all manuscripts to Gregory of Nazianzus, but generally now believed to be a product of 12th century Constantinople, is a puzzling text. Date and authorship are unknown and have been puzzled over since the 19th century. Newer problems include its handling of biblical text, its use of classical hypertexts, and its performance context. Most scholars are uneasy with its combination of sacred drama with secular text. In the set of mid-20th century Byzantine handbooks, the text appears not in Beck's Kirchenliteratur, but twice in Hunger's Profane Literatur. What I want to do today is to look at plot, content, texture, performance and genre to situate the text in 12th century literary society. But first, a little more about secular and sacred in Byzantine culture. For some time, for Byzantinists, particularly for literary scholars, the boundaries have become a little blurred. We no longer insist on the differences of Volksliteratur, Kirchenliteratur, and Profane Literatur, and we've come to analyse religious texts with secular tools. The popularity of proemnasmata among patristic scholars is a case in point. Avril Cameron long ago insisted on treating Romanos alongside Procopius as an author of Justinian's reign. World chronicles are no longer considered monkish or necessarily to be distinguished from histories or ecclesiastical histories. For art historians, it's become an explicit problem more recently, though some time ago it was realised that secular art could embrace sacred, in that patrons might choose to include representations of religious events or personages in domestic or courtly or military or official buildings. More recently, Eunice and Henry Maguire, in Other Icons, suggested using profane rather than secular for what has otherwise been thought of as elite, court, luxury, or art of enjoyment. The biting beasts, the dancing ivory putti, the paladins on the plates, like this one. The Maguire suggests that far from being absent from the supernatural, these images either subvert religious images or enlist supernatural powers in support of the owner. This means that secular, as a neutral term for the non-religious, is now used by scholars such as Alicia Walker only as a problematic term used to interrogate objects and images. But I'm actually going to stick with it this afternoon. Let me introduce my text. The Christos Paschon comprises 30 plus 2,602 iambic lines on the subject of the Passion of Christ. I believe it's the longest extended mimetic treatment of the subject in the 12th century. 25 manuscripts survive from the middle of the 13th century on. It's regarded as anonymous, though the manuscript tradition ascribes it to Gregory of Nazianzus. Herbert Hunger, Wolfram Perrander, convincingly recited it in the 12th century, and authorship has been variously ascribed to Constantine Mathews, John Tzetzes, Theodore Protamos, and most recently, very recently, to Nikephoros Vasilakis. It's a tissue of lines, half-lines, from 4 plays of Euripides, Medea, Hippolytus, Rhesus, and Bacchae, plus rather fewer from Hecuba, Orestes, and Troades. There are some single quotations from other Euripides plays, and a few from Prometheus Bound and the Agamemnon. Quotations from the Gospels, other New and Old Testament books, and from the Acta Pilati also appear. But the vast majority of the quoted text is drawn from the 4 plays, and a majority is spoken by the Theotokos, the protagonist. It's very possibly not 1, but 3 plays, Passion, Burial, and Resurrection. And this proposal was made by the French editor Tuillier in 1969 and has much to recommend it, though it doesn't fit as neatly into the 3 days of Easter as Tuillier suggested. The division is uneven, with the lion's share taken up with the first one, and the second piece suffers from an abrupt beginning. But I shall assume today that that's what we're dealing with. It was a key text in the attempt to argue for a Byzantine drama. And it's been studied by Margaret Alexiou on the Virgin's Lament, Betsy Bowman on the Galactotrof Rusa, and technical aspects of its nature as lament or cento have been considered, but wider issues of reception, identity, performance and purpose have only very recently emerged. Classicists have been more concerned to use the text to understand the manuscript tradition of Bacchae than to see it as a work in its own right, although that has also recently changed. Byzantinists, classicists, theatre scholars are equally puzzled by it. There is a sense that no one is quite sure what to do with it. Now you have the structure on the handout, but particularly for the distant audience, I'll run through very briefly what we have. So, play 1, The Crucifixion. It begins at daybreak on Friday, a few paces from a vantage point on the road to Golgotha. The Virgin stands majestically, upright and static, like the version of Torcello I showed 2 slides back, centre stage throughout the text. She's surrounded by shock after shock as 3 messengers make their way to her one after another, the first announcing the betrayal in the garden, the second describing the trial by the Sanhedrin, and the third takes us to the crucifixion. The women react and comment and support her, but as the messengers leave, she's otherwise alone until the words of Christ to her at line 727. By then, she and the women have gone to witness the crucifixion, where she finds her son and John the theologian, and remains for the rest of the play, lamenting throughout, interceding for Peter, and left bereft at the end, abandoned by her son and helpless as what to do next. The second play, The Burial, is focused on the short journey between the cross and Joseph of Arimathea's rock-cut tomb, and the actors, the Theotokos, John the theologian, Joseph of Arimathea, plus Nicodemus as a non-speaking fourth, make that journey through ritual acts of deposition, threnos, entombment, and telephtheos aspasmos, final greeting, often highlighting movement but almost claustrophobically confined in that space and by the fear of discovery. And the third play, The Resurrection, is in strong contrast to the linear progressions of 1 and 2. It covers a high proportion of the resurrection episodes in an attempt at performed gospel harmony. It moves between the house of John, where the women have spent the night, the tomb where they go, first the Theotokos and the Magdalene, followed by the sleepy chorus, and the house of Mary, where the disciples are based and where all the women go to join the disciples and Cleopas of the Emmaus episode, at the end for the Epiphany of Christ. So now to plot, content, texture, performance, and finally genre. The plot follows the gospel narrative that is handled in very different ways in the 3 different plays. The first, the crucifixion, takes place from around the time of the trial of Jesus and ends with the Theotokos' observation of the breaking of the legs of the robbers and the spearing of Jesus' side. Though the women of Galilee, who form the chorus, try to warn the Theotokos about the events that will unfold, the plot is concentrated in 3 messenger speeches. The first reports the story from the foot washing and Last Supper to the betrayal and the denial of Peter. Only the beloved disciple followed him. The messenger was asked for news of Judas and gave it. He came in the middle of the night with armed men, approached Jesus as a friend, greeted him, kissed him. The second has a headline. The council of scribes and elders have decided to put Jesus to death. The governor Pontius Pilate tried and failed to persuade the crowd. He was already being taken out of the city to be punished. And the third tells Mary that her son is already crucified. The Theotokos responds to their muse with laments, and also sets out her understanding of the meaning of those events, but is drawn into live action only as she makes her way to Golgotha and meets there John the theologian, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and is put in his care, as according to John. She converses with her son. His last words are not, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" as in Matthew and Mark. It is finished, as in John, or "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit," as in Luke, but "now I leave you with these words." The focus on the Theotokos is remarkable. In tragic terms, she's a Euripidean heroine. In biblical terms, her role is greatly expanded. She's at the cross only in John's account, together with her sister, Mary, wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. The focalization of the Passion of Christ through the Passion of the Virgin allows the play to put the action in the context of fall and redemption, and also to place the Virgin's Lament in real time, in a way that even Romanos's Kondakion, Mary at the Cross, does not do. It also allows the many events of the night of Maundy Thursday to be reduced to the clarity of a single messenger's account of each stage. It is an elegant, dramatic solution. In the second play, Burial, the issue is not of too much information to be processed, but too little. In all four Gospels, we're told that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and asked for the body, that he took it down, wrapped it in a linen shroud, which he bought according to Mark, and buried it in a new rock-cut tomb, his own according to Matthew, in a garden according to John, and rolled a stone against the door. John adds the presence of Nicodemus and his myrrh and aloes. All synoptics tell us about the witness of the women, Magdalene and the other Mary, in Matthew, the Magdalene and Mary, mother of James in Mark, simply women of Galilee in Luke. They watch in awe and then leave to prepare ointments in Luke. Matthew adds at 2762 the conspiracy of the chief priests and Pilate. They seal the stone and set a guard. The apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus adds nothing to the burial account, though it's quoted 13 times in this play. None mentions the Theotokos, none John the Theologian. In our play of 771 lines, the Theotokos and John interact with Joseph and Nicodemus. The Virgin carries out a formal threnos, and after the entombment, the telefteos espasmos, and John discourses on the redemption of man and the fate of the Jews. A fourth messenger, after the women have left for John's house, and the Theotokos is lamented again, brings the news of the setting of the guard. The deliberate ritual acts in the confined space at Golgotha and the proleptic explanation of the fall of Jerusalem as a judgment against the Jews for their part in the crucifixion make it a very talky play, but it is also a very visual one. In the Middle Byzantine period, and particularly the 12th century, the Passion cycle was expanded to include scenes of deposition, as you see here, threnos, as you saw on the poster, and entombment, as well as the miraphors and the hierete of what is our third play. Walter Puchner saw the significance of this development for the dating of our text. Nancy Shevchenko has pursued the liturgical antecedents of the Good Friday epitafios, and Robert Osterhout has shown the dramatic connections of these scenes in a culture where he and Henry Maguire have suggested that the feast cycle in wall painting replaces Passion drama. Dramatic tension is supplied by the awareness that Pilate's license to bury did not remove the plotting of the high priests or the enmity of the mob, and they escape only just in time before the guard arrives. If the achievement of the first play is in compression of too much material, and the second development of too little, the problems facing the author of the third play were on quite a different scale. The biblical narratives of the resurrection are a known problem, known for millennia. In performance terms, they most resemble farce, as protagonists wander around in half-light and dawn, stumbling upon a variety of supernatural announcers, young men, angels, of the resurrection, and requiring superhuman mobility with multiple journeys back into town, agonistic foot races, and convenient deceleration or acceleration to ensure individual private experience. Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century, Hesychius of Jerusalem in the 5th, Severus of Antioch in the 6th, had all struggled with the problems. Modern attempts at harmony identify 22 different sequential episodes with 5 different places involved. The Christos Paschon is least confident in this third play, and not only in that it cannot totally rely on its tragic models, because its subject matter is not tragedy. It's this section that has most suggested to modern scholars that the text is unplayable, and I've always thought that the problem lies with the source texts and a determination to achieve a harmony. Whereas the Gospel of John, and indeed Romanos's 6th century Kondakion on the resurrection, puts Mary Magdalene centre stage, in the Christos Paschon, as in John Geometri's Life of the Virgin, that place is occupied by the Theotokos. In this play, despite thin evidence in the Gospels, she could be the other Mary of Matthew, she edges out the Magdalene to second place, various supernatural apparitions to third place, and the chorus of women of Galilee to their usual supporting role. In this version, 3 sections after a dawn prelude correspond not to 3 episodes, but to contrasting treatments of the resurrection material. First, a dramatisation of three experiences of the resurrection: the Theotokos and Mary Magdalene see the empty tomb, Charite, and the chorus with the Magdalene seeing the young man in white. Second, the low-life subplot of the guard, the priest and Pilate. And third, a rapid list of unharmonised episodes in a recapitulation by the Theotokos, then the Magdalene, to the chorus. All three are framed by the waking up at the beginning and at the end with the appearance of Jesus to the 10. Of the 22 points, the Christos Paschon has 18, though only 9 are in the dramatic section 1, 3 are into the introduction, another forms the basis of section 2, 7 are listed in the recapitulation section 3, 1 more forms the basis of the epilogue. Of the 7 possible tomb experiences, Christos Paschon has 4. In the first, dramatic section, the episodes are simplified to the empty tomb, the interview with the angel, the conversation with the gardener, and the larger group of women encountering the young man. 4 points are omitted entirely: the earthquake, Mary Magdalene's speech to Peter and John, Christ's words to the women, and Peter's seeing of the shroud. The deputization of the Magdalene, the dialogue between guard, priest and Pilate, the speech of Christ at the house of Mary are added or expanded, and the part played by the Theotokos and her relationship with the Magdalene are significantly developed, as the role of the men is minimised. So the third play has a complex structure in which a streamlined plot is succeeded by a cynical subplot and a breathless recapitulation, which harmonises what is dramatically viable and lists discarded episodes for the sake of completeness. The protagonist of the whole text is developed here to play a central role that's missing in the source text we have, a commanding role where the Magdalene plays second fiddle and the chorus is very subservient. Just as in the first play, the focus on the Theotokos manages a complex story, and in the second, she has a crucial ritual role, where in the Gospel account she is a spectator at best, and only then if she is the other Mary of Matthew. In general, what we see is a close engagement with the biblical narrative and a strong desire to harmonise the accounts in the context of liturgical and artistic developments. It's a passion play in that it deals with the events of the Passion in a way which respects the events of the canonical Gospels. If we look further at how the story is told, we can see that just as in ancient tragedy there were different bauformen, parados, choral ode, messenger speech, rhesis, lament, so in our text there are easily distinguishable forms of discourse, some of which are the same. Predominant is lament. There are 11 laments, 712 lines of lament material out of 2556 lines, or 2531 without the hypothesis and prayers, or 1905 if we leave out the third play, which doesn't lend itself to lament. The proportion is about 1 in 3, which explains why people have thought of the plays as suffused with lament, or simply as a Virgin's lament. The range of laments offered in these 3 plays is considerable, and each adds to the story. It offers straightforward tripartite solo laments, laments interspersed with choral speeches, the conversation with Christ in which the Virgin's contributions are laments, the long speech in which she realises her son is actually dead, the reduced lament of John, the abandonment to antiphonal grieving with the chorus, the 2 major tripartite set pieces, the brief private laments of the house and on the way to the tomb. They include curse, ritual lament, statement of faith, and lament which turns to joyful welcome. Like ancient tragedy, there are, as we've seen, also messenger speeches, 5 in all, which serve to update the protagonists about important developments, and in the final case, allows a transition to a subplot about the machinations of the chief priests, Herod and the guard. They're differentiated. The first messenger is a disciple who fled with all the others but Peter and John at the betrayal. He knows about the Last Supper, about the agony in the garden, conversations with the disciples and God, what Judas said, which was Here, Rabbi. He follows all the Gospel accounts, but his last 74 lines are of a voice he heard accusing Judas. He'd been asked at the beginning what news there was of Judas, and the report of the diatribe leads smoothly into the Virgin's curse. The second begins efficiently with his headline, and then reveals his viewpoint, entering the city from the country, asking the crowd what was happening. He was blind from birth and been healed by Jesus, so his autopsy is somehow ironic. He gives the clearest view of Jesus, sad and silent, and an indicator of time. Darkness was already disappearing. The third messenger finds it hard to tell his story. viewed with crowds from the Lithostroton outside the city, then following cautiously to a wooded valley where the cross was constructed. He'd spotted the Theotokos and thought to bring her up to date. The fourth messenger comes to Mary at John's house after the burial. He's one of his disciples, asking the women for the Theotokos because he has worrying news. The large troop of armed guards have been ordered by Pilate, as in Matthew, to seal the tomb for fear that disciples might carry off the body. His information given, he departs. The last messenger comes in the third play, while Mary Magdalene is travelling to inform the disciples of her experiences of the resurrection. He's also a disciple of Jesus, though the Theotokos cannot recognise him, and he brings good news. Not new news, it is that Christ has left Hades. What interests the Theotokos is how he knew, and the answer is not another apparition, but her discovery that the guard had left the tomb and gone to the high priest to tell of their miraculous experience. He followed them and heard their conversations verbatim. 2210 to 2269 in the Legacies, supplying direct speech and speech indicators, but from 2270 the conversation is presented as pure mimesis, as a subplot, comic in that political cover-ups never go out of fashion. In all, there are 23 exchanges, a few in the middle in Stichomythia. The account in Matthew is extended, and the bribery of the guard and handling of Pilate is accomplished. The messenger sees this as proof that the guard were witnesses of the resurrection and has come to the Theotokos to tell her. All speeches, though characterized, differentiated, and on occasion elaborated, stick closely to the gospel accounts. At beginning and end are a hypothesis of 30 lines and 2 prayers, one to the Pandanax of 39 lines, one to the Theotokos of 30 lines. The hypothesis invites pious hearers of poems to hear a pious poem, the Kosmosoterion Tauta, in the manner of Euripides. Readers will learn all the mysteries from the mouth of the Virgin Mother and the beloved disciple of the Master. She's the first presented, and as a mother lamenting at the moment of the Passion. Her moans recall the fall without which the redemption would not have been possible. The actors of the drama are listed incompletely: the all-pure mother, the virgin disciple, and the women who accompany the mother of the Lord. The prayers at the end are personal to the author, not on behalf of mankind. He accepts that Christ has already redeemed mankind. He confesses his sins, asks God for pity, not to abandon him, and to allow him the Theotokos as intercessor. He praises the Virgin as all blessed, never young, offers her a crown plaited from the flowers of the meadow and his own prayers. He asks for her protection against fire and darkness, and returns to a hymn of greeting, Vespina Pandanasa, joy of the human race, always benevolent, and truly for me, he says, the greatest salvation. Soteria is the last word of the text. Prayers are not unusual in the long poems of the 12th century, secular as well as religious, but these pick up the themes of what has come before, and particularly in a final group of passages which would classify in tragedy as Rhesus. 5 theological speeches, 2 by the Theotokos in the first play, and 3 by John the theologian, 1 in the first and 2 in the burial play. It is in a way his justification for crashing the scene. The first play opens with a long speech by the Theotokos in the fall. There's a long counterfactual passage which argues that the incarnation would have been impossible without the fall. She recalls the presentation in Simeon's prophecy, her birth without pain, and the joyful happiness of the Annunciation. There are 3 very personal passages, 24 to 28. Nor would I now be hearing how the Son of Heaven and Earth, the virgin birth, is dragged before justice. I would not be shivering at the prospect of watching him hurt, while bearing without fire, alas, a dreadful flame which eats me up, stirs up my spirit, and pierces my heart like a great sword. And 69 to 70. How can I now see him assaulted? Having escaped pain, how shall I bear pain in my heart? Which brings the theoretical argument about fall and incarnation to her present predicament. And she ends with another personal note and her current dilemma. I decided to go out in the night to see my son suffer his passion, but they persuaded me to await the light of day. Her second speech comes after her second lament, and before the arrival of the third messenger. It's about the virgin birth and her anomalous status as virgin and mother, and sees her present sufferings as substitute for the pains of childbirth. She was, still is, a virgin, never knowing pleasure, never penetrated, carefully practicing women's virtues and maintaining her reputation. Thus she became the spouse of God and gained a son, such as no other woman could boast to have borne. The third speech is by John on salvation. It comes after the Virgin's fifth lament, after she realises that Christ is dead, and before his own brief lament at 998 to 1002. He tries to console her, using topi of consolatio, with the voluntary nature of Christ's death and its impact, breaking the bonds on the human race and overthrowing the devil. Christ was tested like gold in a crucible and came through, renewing, rejuvenating men by removing the decay of the ancient sin. He predicts the redemption of Eve, the joy of friends and disciples when he rises again on the day of joy. He who now knows true sadness will show in 3 days a gleaming joy. He predicts glory for the Virgin, honours and church dedications, and the land of Solomon becoming a holy land. This is why the Virgin should not weep excessively. She knows that joy is coming. All she has to do is to get through the next 2 days. The fourth and fifth speeches, both by John, come after the ritual acts are complete and before Joseph and Nicodemus depart. The fourth, on redemption and punishment, acclaims Jesus as God, as Son of God, and as the best of men, known through his works and his achievement of liberating the human race. Adam will be rescued, and in rising again, Jesus will be recognised as God. If he'd stayed in heaven, only the heavenly host would have known his goodness, and this is the reason for birth and death, the salvation of man. He proceeds to consider punishment for what a hitherto beloved people did to their benefactor, stirred up by envy. He predicts exile, the fall of Jerusalem, the Jewish diaspora. John and Joseph return to the fate of Judas. He will see the last judgment. Joseph then laments for Jerusalem, and John launches into his final speech at 1712, elaborating on the fate of Jerusalem, the purpose of the descent into hell. Christ will call to come back, and all will recognise him, from the tops of mountains to the caverns of the earth. They'll acknowledge him, and suffering blows will demonstrate a sure faith. But for now, Joseph must leave Jerusalem. Before leaving, he checks with John that he expects to see the Master in this country, and John replies, yes, tomorrow. They look forward to the third day, and Joseph and Nicodemus take their leave. These speeches, which have no origin in the biblical narrative, show the author's concern, an entirely religious concern, to emphasise the importance of what has been performed before our eyes, a wider story of fall, incarnation, redemption, salvation, and judgment. So far, our viewing of plot and content has revealed overwhelmingly theological concerns. The conflict with secular concerns comes into play when we consider texture. The combination of Christian plot and ancient cento need not automatically cause concern, but it is when the Mother of God voices Medea, Phaedra, Agave, Clytemnestra, iconic wicked women of mythology, that scholars have taken fright. A third of our text is made up of lines, half-lines, echoes, or larger chunks of Euripidean text, but it should be clear that this is not an orthodox cento as practiced in late antiquity with the rules codified by Ausonius. Indeed, some scholars have doubted whether it's a cento at all. Semek Marciniak has very recently argued that we don't need to think of it as a cento because there are so many forms of intertextuality at play in 12th century Byzantium. I think we should take a little time now to see how it's used. So if we look at the use in the Paschon of the four main source texts, it can be seen as thoughtful. The quotations are not random or mechanical. That's right, Rachel Bryant Davis has noted, nor is there a straightforward transfer of text from character to character, a point made by Carla Pohlmann. There's flexibility in who voices the lines. It doesn't smack of parody, nor is it a juvenile school exercise. The author has thought carefully about his source plays, has identified speeches with the strongest emotional punch, and has reminded his audience of them and their relevance to the ultimate drama of the Passion. If we look at the use of Medea, the first crucifixion play begins with Medea 1 and ends at 11:30 to 33 with the last lines of Medea minus the closing formula. The first speech of the Theotokos starts strongly with use of the nurse's speech, and the exchange between Theotokos and chorus before the first messenger arrives draws on the chorus telling Jason of his son's death. Much of the source play goes unused. 300 lines out of 1419 are used. Our author chooses moments of high emotion or horror or dramatic action. Medea's farewell to the children, the death of Jason's wife, Medea weeping once the die is cast and she cannot go back on her actions. In the second burial play, Medea takes a back seat, though it appears in the early dialogue between Joseph and John the theologian, and in the Threnos. In the third resurrection play, use of powerful emotional passages, Medea's gift to the bride, exchanges between Medea and Jason, compensates for sparing use of the text as a whole. So 1 is rich in Medea, 2 and 3 not so, but the prayer to the Theotokos ends with a reference to Medea, the last reused lines in the trilogy. As a reading of Medea, the Christos Paschon emphasises not the witch or the monster or the xeni, but the weeping mother, bereft of any family support, as she makes up her mind to sacrifice a child. It shows a strong woman outraged by betrayal, and a Theotokos who has absorbed the torments of Medea, and as we'll see, of Agave and Phaedra, as she voices her. In Hippolytus, the text offers rich and varied opportunities to the author of the Christos Paschon, but the profile of appropriation is similar to that of Medea. The first play is the richest, and thereafter use declines, though it's strong in the prayer to the Virgin at the end. In the first play, emotional moments are mirrored: shock at news, horror, realization of a woman's precarious position, the death of a loved one, the grieving of a parent, pleas for forgiveness, the lament of creation. Several of these passages amass 3 or more loci from Hippolytus. In the second play, actions are mirrored: taking down or taking up the body, holding the beloved in one's arms, ordering burial, ordering entombment, invoking the mourning in the community, saying farewell, the discovery of a suicide by hanging, and messenger tropes. In the third play, what comes through is more a typology. The Theotokos is briefly Aphrodite and more consistently Artemis. Christ is sharing the merits and the Magdalene, the loving impatience of Hippolytus. This can be seen also in 1, where the Virgin on Christ echoes Artemis on Hippolytus, and where the Virgin's virginity echoes that of Hippolytus. But it's much more visible in the final play and the last prayer to the Virgin. The tragic premature death through machination of a chaste hero and the stately divinity of mother or patron are underlined in this way. Unlike in many modern receptions, Phaedra and her torments are hardly considered, though her quick intelligence in foreseeing her downfall is a model for the Theotokos' growing understanding of what unfolds before her eyes. The Rhesus, unlike Medea and Hippolytus, appears both late and sparsely, and builds to richer treatment in the second play, particularly from 2:17-15 on, as the entombment is completed, and John, Joseph, and the Theotokos talk of dispersal. From now, Rhesus and Bacchae predominate in the trilogy, and switching between one and the other can indicate exits and entrances. From 1813 to 55, we see night drawing on, and from then to 1995 in the third play, the Awakening of the Women. So far, the main contribution has been atmospheric: suspicion, danger, caution, mission on the one hand, the interplay of night and day, wakefulness and sleepiness on the other. In 3, there's more emphasis both on the comic potential of blundering about in the dark, and also on Rhesus as long-awaited saviour, bringing his army for Thessaly, like Christ from Hades. Throughout, but particularly in 2, the parallel between mourning mothers, Muse and Theotokos is drawn. The author of the Paschon uses the atmosphere of mistrust to create a world of threat, but also focuses on the natural descriptions of darkness and light to create stunningly lovely evocations of the women fighting off sleep as the weekend's events demand wakefulness at night and enforced rest during the day. The comic potential of the blundering about in the dark is fully utilised in the pilot subplot, but the arrival of a long-awaited saviour, teamed with the presence of the Muse, the only innocent mother allowed to grieve in all 4 source plays, offers a more spiritual Byzantine reading. Of our 4 source plays, Bacchae is least used, and again it builds from a late and sparse beginning to a richer mixture at the second half of 1 and in 2. The generally thinner but less superficial use of this source text actually enables a more powerful message as the horror of the story of Bacchae is applied to the Passion. The first play focuses heavily on the parallelism between Mathews and Christ, whereas the second play broadens to the wider cast, Theotokos and her women as Agave and the Maenads, and as Cadmus in Lament, Joseph as Agave the carpenter, and as Cadmus the exile. third play, as well as comparisons of women on the loose at the tomb and on the mountain as Maenads, and threats in the subplot reflecting Dionysus and Pentheus, deals more with religious aspects in plays. The escape of Christ from the tomb, the Bacchantes from prison, Christ's conquest of Hades, and the ravaging of Dionysus' foes. Affirmations of faith to Christ and to Dionysus. In contrast to modern readings, the Paschon considers the nature of religious experience, faith and defiance, and above all the horror of violent death. I've recently suggested that the use of source texts in the Christos Paschon can be seen as spolia, like the panels in the little metropolis in Athens, but also as painting, pointilliste, or broad brush. Sometimes bare canvas in painting is caused by accommodations not just of gender, number or tense, but more significant ones. Sometimes the reader is expected to remember the original formulation, as when thumos is replaced by lipi, vulima by elpis. The pointilliste effect is increased by the way two lines can be combined into one, sometimes one spread out into two, or one into three. Sometimes very few words over several lines point out the source passage in a way that only the keenest ear could have detected. Sometimes paraphrase rather than textual mimesis is found. Sometimes the same quotation appears at the beginning and end of an argument as a frame. Sometimes a shift in source text indicates stagecraft. Doubling can be informative. Using both Medea and Jason on parenting in the Theotokos' voice says something about the text's view of her as a mother. Comparisons are important, but contrasts are also. We're asked to read how different the Theotokos is from Medea, as well as their similarities. Alternatively, the use of the source text can be seen as polyphony. Play 1 starts with Medea, Hippolytus enters at 5, Rhesus at 87, Bacchae at 161. We then see at 2, 1275 to 1305, Joseph the Theotokos and John in the Deposition voice each play in turn. At times of the greatest emotion, polyphony is richest. At 1:848, when the Theotokos realizes that Christ is dead, Agave's realization that she's killed her child is interwoven with Hippolytus seeing his stepmother dead, and Artemis realizing that Hippolytus is close to death. In 2, the moment of deposition has all four texts conveying the shock of Medea's outrageous response to the messenger. Agave on Dionysus in Messenger 2, Artemis telling Theseus to take Hippolytus inside, and a wake-up call for Hector from Rhesus. At 1340, the 6th lament passage uses the Muses' lament and Cadmus' lament over Pentheus. Later it combines all four with the moment of Hippolytus' death, the introduction to the Muses' lament, Cadmus bringing Pentheus' body into the palace, and Jason prevented from burying or mourning his boys. In 3, which is predominantly Rhesus, Christ shocks with his one-word line, character, at 2097, and the Theotokos responds as Rhesus does to Hector on his first appearance, the chorus to Dionysus claiming his power, and the horrible death of Jason's bride. But we should note that Euripides is not the only source of the wording of the plays. As well as following the biblical plot, the text also alludes to specific biblical and apocryphal passages. 57 from Matthew, 37 from Mark, 43 from Luke, 44 from John. Romans and 1 Corinthians are noted 3 times and twice respectively, Acts and 1 Timothy once. There are 7 quotations from the Psalms, 5 from Genesis, 1 each from Proverbs, Jonah, Exodus, and 1 Maccabees. The Acta Polati has 35 references, nearly as many as from Mark. This is remarkable in that normally in Byzantine texts, biblical quotations are lashed on, classical used more sparingly. It's also unusual in that where biblical references are rich, psalms are usually the commonest and richest hypertexts. It is also notable that while the Euripidean references are precise or deliberately changed, a high proportion of the biblical references are identified either by a single word or by paraphrase. When levels of Greek clash, it's the classicizing rather than the biblical kimi that takes precedence. It's also notable that these references are relatively thin on the ground, 2 or 3 per page of text, or a little bit more, occasionally. And let me show you an exception, which is Christ's appearance to the 10 at Mary's house. And another one of those is the hierete, in fact, and it may not be accidental that these appearances are the densest passage with biblical reference. But even here you can see that there's a lot of paraphrase and occasional words, not great passages of the original. Another example, and half lines are very rare, we spotted one before. Here's another one, bottom right, Ton Theron kept his men on, as the chorus notes their arrival at the house of Mary. But these are very much exceptions. So the texture of the Christos Paschon is 1/3 Euripidean quotation, 2/3 Euripidean pastiche, with occasional reminiscences of biblical or apocryphal text, inserted sparingly rather than massed, a combination of secular with religious wording. At the beginning, we noted that among the difficulties scholars have had with the Paschon is whether it's performable, and if so, where. Dr. Puchner declared that it is unperformable, largely in terms of misunderstandings of the 5th century tragedy, I fear. We can be sure that it was not fully staged, as tragedy was performed in 5th century Athens. But the performance of tragedy had gone through many changes since then. We don't know when the last tragedy was staged, but full staging would have been a revival, not out of keeping, perhaps, with 12th century tastes, but absolutely entirely undocumented. On the other hand, it's highly unlikely that the piece was not performed in some way. As we have increasingly realised that Byzantium was a highly performative society, it becomes harder to think of kinds of writing that were not performed. Letters read aloud on delivery, poems read in front of tombs, the constituent episodes of historiography told as stories, progressive ascetic collections read in refectories, theological treatises actually located in religious disputations, even commentaries, which we might have considered the most visual and silent of works, we've been reminded recently, are deeply rooted in school and practice. But in what setting might it have been performed? Although we've come to realise more pieces were performed in churches than we might have thought, a lot of hagiography with rhetorical prefaces, for example, it's very difficult to think of this text in church. There is no liturgical context. It's long, the cento is very prominent. The prayers are personal, not communal. Monastic suggestions with Western parallels, like Prosvita and Hildegard of Bingen, are attractive but unprovable, I think. And it's very far from the refectory reading matter listed in Founder's Typica. Liturgical Typica give us a sense of life day by day in a monastery, leaving little space for the performance of even the 625 lines of the shortest of the plays. A religious performance context looks remote at this point. We should look to other possibilities. The theatre of Comnenian ladies are where letters and short rhetorical pieces were read aloud and improvised. The options for performance in the theatron are rhetorical. Psalos's characterization of Kroustalas reading from the Minoloion suggests that a single performer could assume many parts. Alternatively, we could think of the rhetoric-rich schoolroom, where schoolboys learnt to improvise the ear of women, like Vasilakis's What the Theotokos Would Say. A younger, beardless Theotokos might be more convincing in delivery, perhaps. And the work of Marjorie Curry Woods in Weeping for Dido offers us this, medieval school manuscripts as scripts that is meant to be performed aloud. In Byzantium too, we could argue that learning literature was a shared social experience rather than an individual relationship with a physically, visually conveyed text. But even if neither of these solutions represents the real performance history of our text, and the only performance was in the mind of private readers, we've seen enough to determine whether this hypothetical Noetic audience of the 12th century was fully able to envisage the performance of a tragedy with chorus, 3 actors, mechani, theologion, and so bring our text alive through fantasia. This hypothetical audience might even have been appreciative of the innovative elements which so puzzled the modern scholar and have made it a problem play. And so finally to genre, which is, I think, what my title promises. Is the Christos Paschon a tragedy? Is it a passion play? But first, perhaps, we need to ask whether it is diegesis or mimesis. Is it actually a play? The hypothesis calls it a drama with prosopa, but then the 12th century novels are also called dramata. Demeter in some manuscripts label it stichi, lines, others tragoedia. It has every appearance of being a play, but it often combines description with representation, diegesi with mimesis. And I've argued that this doesn't prevent modern plays, like these two, being regarded as plays. They do different things, but quite similar things in combination of diegesis and mimesis. In all three cases, I would argue that the doubling of diegesis with mimesis confirms and enriches the action. Could we possibly see it as passion or possibly mystery play? We've seen that in terms of plot and content, it's not inconsistent with any in Latin or vernaculars that have come down to us. It is, however, very much longer, and its texture is not made up of biblical texts, as are, for example, the Monte Cassino and Benedict Boyan plays. It could not have evolved from the liturgy, like Quaeritis. It's not structured to enable movement between locations, like the late medieval Chester or York cycles. The Cyprus Passion play, the cycle, published in Notre Dame in 1947, assumes both performance and also a filling out of the scenario that we have with biblical text, not a tour de force, a Euripidean cento and pastiche. I am persuadable, particularly in this room, and I do see it as a passion play, but I see a great divide between our texts and their Latin contemporaries. So is it tragedy? Or indeed, a trilogy? As Tweedier suggests, and we have assumed so far this afternoon, for me the arguments fall more convincingly on his side. It makes sense of night and day, it simplifies the unities, it explains the repetitions after the death of Christ. So we need to ask whether we're dealing with three tragedies. Again, for me, the balance of the argument suggests that the author was fully aware of tragic conventions and did well to balance them with the constraints of sacred geography and the variety of biblical narratives. At first sight, the length of the piece, at 2,531 lines, is excessively long for an Athenian tragedy, and particularly and possibly for performance of sitting. But our text as a whole is no longer than one of the revived Comnenian novels. In three separate plays makes it even more possible, nor is it essential that the whole of any one play needs to be performed at a sitting, as the later performance history of Euripides makes clear. Another difficulty is that it's difficult to recognise tragic form in the homogeneity of the Byzantine 12-syllable metre. Choral ode and actors' parts are all the same. But as Psellos pointed out, Byzantine metre had moved on. It's unreasonable to expect the full array of ancient metres on the page to be read in an accentual performance practice. But I believe, and I've argued elsewhere, that it's nevertheless as easy to see as a tragedy as many modern versions of Euripidean plays, like Marina Carr's By the Bob of Cats, inspired by the Medea. It shows understanding of the conventions of tragedy in general, and of specifically Euripidean features. Puchner argued it wasn't a tragedy but a cento, but I don't see why now, and I hope you can see it too. It could be both. Even Puchner allows that the author has some sense of the conventions of tragedy. The first 700 lines of the Virgin and women receiving messengers one after another, the satisfying Deus ex machina of Christ at the house of Mary, begin and end the trilogy. And the text is arranged always for three actors and chorus, despite the claim of the hypothesis, and those three actors are different in the three plays. Theotokos, John the Theologian, and Christ in the Crucifixion, Theotokos, John the Theologian, Joseph in the middle play, Theotokos, Magdalene, and Christ in the Resurrection play, Pilate, the spokesman of the priests, mouthpiece of the guard, in the subplot. Some of Puchner's objections are to do with staging. The time it takes, or the short time it takes, to get from the tomb to the house of Mary, for example, and here we should acknowledge the difficulties. But other criticism involve innovations, like the combination of mimesis with diegesis, or messenger speech with typoscopia, or the extraordinary transition from messenger speech into comic subplot we've already observed. And here we might simply applaud the innovation and accept that tragedy had already moved on from the 5th century, and that a Byzantine tragedy could be something else again. This argument also works if we note the difficulties the author contended with, difficulties of time, space, and emotion. It's not true that all 5th century plays were rooted in one spot, or ran in real time, or all ended, as we would say, tragically. But our author had to contend with all three, and with an emotional trajectory that is like no Athenian drama. Its movement from dread to hope to joy, all in the context of fear, is remarkable and unique, a point the author might have made. We might also ask whether it is Euripidean. It claims to be, may well be, at least a Byzantine understanding of what was Euripidean. Recently it's become clear that what Euripides was most valued for was his handling of emotion. In the Beyond Praxis, he's bought as a slave in order to perform a lament. In the Datomir Machia, Euripidean passages are cited to increase the emotional effect. The high proportion of lament in our text bears comparison with Hecuba or Troades. Other features, like the woman protagonist, the diminishing of the role of the chorus, and the ending, could be seen as typically Euripidean. So a text that is in plot and content one thing, and in texture, performance, and genre another, struggles to find its place in any context in Byzantium. It was not until the Renaissance, partly on the basis of the reading of the Paschon, that Christian tragedy became a recognized genre. Yet 12th century Constantinople, with its culture of innovation, its nurturing of hybrids, its strong performativity, its interest in emotion and mimesis, offers a credible context for this case of medieval crossover. Reading the secular against the sacred in Byzantium, I hope you will agree, produced a remarkable, indeed a unique text.
We do have time for some questions, and if you'd be happy to field them. And Megan, will we have some perhaps come in online?
I will let you know.
Okay,
And then, yes.
great, thank you. Who wants to go first?
I want to bring this chair out, won't I? Not to be hidden behind the thing. What should we do? Can you get it through?
Well done, Alexis.
That's much easier. So, hello, Alexander.
Yeah, thank you for that. This was really inspiring and very interesting. I was wondering, is there a way to define a little bit better the linguistic register of the text? I mean, of course, you mentioned there are lots of quotations and so, and this, of course, then leads us elsewhere and so, but perhaps with authorial interventions into the language, amendments, changes in comparison to the original text, and so is there something that would allow us to connect it more closely with rhetorical traditions of the 12th century, for example?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
That's obviously a desideratum. And I've only realised very recently why the biblical quotations are so odd. I mean, it seems so obvious once you realise it. But until then, you can't have two levels operating simultaneously where things are so chopped up. So I think that we need a full analysis, linguistic analysis, of how the levels work and what happens when there's a choice. And I think I'll be borne out. I haven't done this analysis, but I think I will be borne out that if there is a choice, then the high one is chosen rather than the low, the key knee. And I think I want to talk to Martin Hinterberger about exactly how one might actually do this kind of analysis. But thank you.
Thank you.
We do have a question from our YouTube viewers. Margaret, would you mind repeating the question to the microphone or recapping the question to the microphone before you answer it?
Okay.
Tthink you so much.
Can I be heard where I'm sitting?
Yes.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
so. Great. So our question is from Julia Pare, and she would like to know, first, thank you so much for your excellent talk. Regarding the CP as 3 rather than 1 tragedies, is there any manuscript evidence for divisions within the work, such as marks or spacing?
No. That I certainly have to do. Prunea knew the manuscript. Sorry, the question is about the division into 3 plays, not 1, and whether there is manuscript evidence for that, whether there is anything which could bear it out. And yes, of course, we have to look at that. Tuidier didn't know the manuscripts very well, and he doesn't adduce specific manuscript evidence, which makes me think that perhaps it's not there, but it doesn't stop me from having to do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the staging question,
Mm-hmm.
and I was just puzzled about one little thing. No masks. How do you know?
The question is about masks. How do we know? How do we know that they did not have masks?
Right.
And the only piece I have published on this so far, the reader asked that question. So I looked quite a lot at masks. And there is nothing very late at all to suggest that they could exist. I mean, they don't survive.
Mm-hmm.
What we have is representations of masks, don't we? We don't have a single ancient mask surviving. So it's a difficult question. We should keep our minds open on this point, which leads us into a whole other questions about the effects of masking in performance, which there's been a lot of really interesting work on very recently. But I think this is one of the things one can't check in a way, whereas I can go to the manuscripts and see if there's any markers for the three plays, and I can actually sit down and figure out what the linguistic levels are. So I think we keep our minds open, but I think it's unlikely.
The staging.
But it's a great question.
Hi. I was very intrigued by the inclusion of the Medea as, Mary using Medea's words. I was wondering, is there any sense of a redemption for Medea as a mournful mother using her words through Mary? Medea is still clearly seen as a monstrous figure, but using her figure as mother seems really interesting.
If I repeat that, the question is about Medea and a possible redemption for Medea in using her words so richly. There is no direct one-to-one relationship. Theotokos does voice Medea, she voices a lot of other people. But it does include all these strong Euripidean heroines, all of whom could be thought of being in some need of redemption too. And I suspect there is some sense of trying to see a continuum, trying to see the human fallout of all these stories, and seeing a human story as well as a divine story working together through the text. So I think in a way you're right, that there is. And there's certainly, I think, a sense of motherhood. What can motherhood drive you to do or not? And I think that works across quite a lot of the plays. I think it works in the trilogy as well. Thank you.
Hi. Something I thought was really interesting you talked about was the messenger speeches, which obviously those have a classical model, but I just found messenger speeches are heavily based on the gospel, but chronologically speaking, these people are sort of proclaiming the gospel before the gospels have been written. Do you think, particularly maybe looking at the uses of paraphrase, is the author at all maybe playing around with kind of thinking about like the development of the Gospels or the kind of idea of proclaiming the Gospel?
That's a really interesting question about the messenger speeches and the use of Gospel narrative in them before the Gospels are written. And I really wonder whether that's a level that is there as well as all the other levels of meaning and comprehension we can see in the text. Just whether there is anything about biblical writing that's happening in there. I really have just started fairly recently the biblical analysis. That's probably clear. I've done the classical, but I'm now trying to do the biblical. And I will take that on board and think about it as I go. It's a nice thought, isn't it? It's a good one.
Any other questions?
Well, it's a really dumb question. I do apologise for it because it just reflects my ignorance. But is there any artistic evidence of liturgical performance or the use of drama as a means of communicating sacred history? Because obviously in the West there is in this period. Is there any in the East?
It's the big question. It's not a stupid question. It's a question that got people very excited in the middle of the 20th century. And we have given up. Partly Walter Puchner put his finger on it, and we are now trying to find a way out of that, because we've also simultaneously become aware that the culture as a whole is so performative. So it is rather strange that there isn't. But there is, I don't believe there is any representation. The odd snatches of possibility, Lupran seemed to see something on the streets, and that really can't be built into anything. Simeon of Thessaloniki has an apolythea for the three children in the burning fiery furnace, and that's been looked at quite a lot recently by Alex Lingas and Andy Walter-White, and they are not prepared to regard that as liturgical drama. So I think we're at a point where we say no, there wasn't any liturgical drama in Byzantium, as far as we know. We have representations of what's the closest, a procession? I think would be the closest we've got. And we've got quite a few processions, and we've got quite a few representations of Minaloyan and in wall painting, but not of drama, as we would recognise it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Annie?
About genre, if it is one play, I mean, if it's three, maybe the first two are tragedies, but if you include the resurrection, doesn't that make it a comedy, a commedia?
Well, this is the problem. And there are big problems for that author, and the subject matter is clearly one of them. But there are 5th century tragedies that do end happily, and it is something that Aristotle bore in mind as a possibility. So, in a way, it looks impossible from the start. How on earth would one do it? But actually it is managed, and it has its own share of the topic, I suppose. And I think ending, making that the appearance through the closed doors, but actually you can imagine it on the Theological in a Greek theatre. It makes it more convincing in a way. So it's a huge problem, the third play.
Because if I understand your digest correctly, Christ is still present. I mean, is he actually speaking? Is his mission
At the end,
to the
he
apostles?
speaks. He speaks. He foreshadows the mission.
Because that is very odd. Because if you thought whether I don't know whether I can get terribly excited about whether it's a tragedy or a comedy, but if you thought that if the writer was trying to echo structurally parts 1 and 2 and parts 3, he would have included the essential, and that would have been a kind of, that would have been an ending which corresponds to the tragic endings of parts 1 and 2.
I think it's almost impossible to imagine how one could think of staging the Ascension, even noetically. Is it done in the West?
Yes.
It must be done in the West.
Yes.
How's it done?
Yes. How? To the road.
Well, I think it's quite consistent in this text, because you start in medias res, in fact, and you only get most of the events of Maundy Thursday coming through, and the night coming through in the messenger speeches. And so you also have this forward-looking speech at the end, which promises, I'm trying to think if there might even be a very small reference to the Ascension. I'm trying to remember whether it is. But it looks forward to other events afterwards. to Pentecost as well,
I see.
very likely.
Question over there.
So keeping in mind that your argument that it's non-liturgical, which I'm definitely convinced by, has anyone taken a close look at comparing this to the great liturgical texts of Byzantium? For instance, you mentioned the Pentateuch of Romanos.
I think a lot more could be done. I've looked at Romanos' first resurrection, which is very interesting, very close to John, more successful in that it doesn't try to handle gospel harmony, but it also sticks with the Magdalene as a central figure, which is actually easier, I think, to handle than the move to the Theotokos. I think more could be done, but a lot more could be done on a lot of fronts.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Anybody want to make a case for a passion play?
I'm coming back to that idea of the Euripidean language in the mouth of the Theotokos. I'm wondering if, given how the Holy Week hymnody juxtaposes the character of Eve as a tragic and perhaps even quasi-villainous character with her redemption in the Theotokos, if this is implicit in the way that these Euripidean figures are placed in her mouth and she's then becomes a redemptive figure for them as well.
Yeah, I like that very much. And Eve does appear. I don't think she is named anywhere, but it's perfectly clear who she is. And I think she takes her place alongside these other women,
Okay,
who all get the chance of redemption, of course,
beautiful, thank you.
in the course of it. Thank you. Very nice.
Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking Professor Mullett for a fabulous lecture. And I want to express my thanks again to the Mathews brothers for giving us this endowment, which allows us to enrich our Byzantine Studies program even more. And I hope you'll come back next year for the Mathews Lecture whenever that is scheduled. There is a reception right through that door in the back. We will unlock it for you. Don't try now, it's still locked. And I hope you all join us there for a little bit of refreshment after the lecture. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
It was lovely.